And we are live, broadcasting from the great ether/internet. Welcome to Poets House live streaming. Poets House is with you in solidarity. My name is Paulo Javier, and I am a poet and program director of the organization. I offer my respect to Lenape people and to their continuing presence in their homeland and throughout the diaspora. I offer my reverence. Poets House is our nation's poetry library with an open stack featuring over 70,000 volumes that welcomes everyone to read and be inspired by poetry. Even though we are closed to the public at the moment, Poets House continues to find ways to share the resources of our library and programming online to invite everyone into the transformative power of poetry. To this end, I'm really pleased that my colleague Suzanne Wise can join me for tonight's program.
Hi, thank you, Paolo. I'm so happy to be here tonight. Happy to be with Lisa Saloy and Nicole Wallace, who are helping us highlight our chapbooks of the Mimeo Revolution series, which digitizes chapbooks from the 1960s to the early 80s, when small presses exploded across the country. It's been a particular goal of our project to make available out-of-print, hard-to-find works by under-recognized but essential authors. Diane Burns's 1981 Riding the One-Eyed Ford, the only collection she published during her lifetime, was a prime candidate for the project. Bob Kaufman's 1967 Golden Sardine from City Lights, only one of 3 books he published in his life, was another. In addition to providing scans of the chapbooks on our website, we also offer related commentary and multimedia about the authors, the books, and their publishers to provide context and poetic history. I encourage you to explore these materials, which can be found along with other volumes from the series, by going to the Media tab on our website and selecting Digital Collections from the drop-down menu. Thank you so much, and I'm so grateful to our presenters tonight.
Thank you, Suzanne, who is streaming in from Killington, Vermont. Suzanne will be rejoining me after the presentations. This event spotlights the authors of these 2 rare chapbooks that Suzanne mentioned, part of our ongoing Chapbooks of the Mimeo Revolution digitization project. Diane Burns and Bob Kaufman, I am so pleased to be welcoming our first presenter tonight, poet, musician, and managing director of the Poetry Project, Nicole Wallace, who will be presenting on Chemehuevi and Anishinaabe poet Diane Burns. Nicole, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. Anim Boju, Nicole Indigenicas, Makwan Indodem, Kakabakang Indonjaba, Lenape Hoking Inda. Hi, everybody. My name is Nicole Wallace, and I'm joining you from where I live, which is on the unceded territory of the Lenape and Canarsie people, or what is currently called Brooklyn, New York. I really want to thank Poets House, and especially Paulo and Suzanne, for inviting me to be a part of the digitized chapbook launch of Diane Burns's long out-of-print chapbook, Riding the One-Eyed Ford, which, as Suzanne mentioned, was originally published by Contact 2 Press in 1981. Being a part of this project has really meant so much to me, so Chemehuevi for including me. Throughout this whole process, I've been primarily working with the ever-incredible Suzanne Wise on 2 components, the chapbook overview and then the other biographically centered interview conversation piece on Diane Burns. The chapbook overview piece focuses just on that. It gives context to the publication and then also goes into some of the finer details about the work that comprises the chapbook. The biographical piece initially posed somewhat of maybe a formal challenge when Suzanne and I were first starting to talk about it and think about it, in that most of the other pieces for Poets House's digitized chapbook series were a little bit more scholarly in nature and pulled in a lot of secondary writing that had been done on the authors and their work. But for Diane Burns, this kind of writing, research, and work really has yet to be done. So nothing like that existed, though it should. So what do you do? So we thought about that. And from my perspective and experience as someone who just recently, within the last few years learned about Diane's work, I immediately wanted to know more about her life, her work, her community. The way that I've gone about doing that was through talking to people and other poets that she knew, such as Bob Kaufman and Steve Cannon, who were friends of Diane's and knew her either around the time that the chapbook was published and or shortly thereafter. Steve and Diane in particular had a close friendship over the years. Diane at times lived and worked at tribes on and off for many years, as well as frequently hung out there reading to Steve and working on her own writing. So I've just been really grateful to both Bob and Steve for their willingness to share these stories, memories, and at times other published work of Diane's that's not easily accessible online or in print. In saying that, I'm certainly and deeply missing Steve Cannon right now and his wonderfully prismatic and connective presence. But throughout this process, one of the most important relationships that and connections that's really emerged for me was finally getting to make contact and know Diane's daughter, Britta Rona, who still lives in the city today with her family. I first met Britta this past December and have been so thrilled and honored and excited to have her be a part of all of this interest in Diane's work and a part of these projects as we've been working on them. So to make this somewhat long story, just a little longer, Bob and Britta both amazingly agreed to have a conversation with me, as Suzanne mentioned, about Diane's work in life, which then became the biographical piece that will be published alongside the chapbook. I'm sure some of you who are watching know Diane's work and or perhaps you knew her yourself, and other folks might not. So I'm just going to start with a brief, quick intro to Diane, and then I'm going to read a short excerpt from the chapbook overview piece that I wrote for this project. Diane Burns was born January 11th, 1956 in Lawrence, Kansas. Her father was Chemehuevi and her mother was Anishinaabe. She grew up in Riverside, California until the age of 10, when her family moved to the Lakudere Reservation in Hayward, Wisconsin. Diane spent her senior year of high school at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and then received a scholarship to study law at Barnard College, where she dropped out her senior year. After hearing about an opportunity through the American Indian Community House, in which they were offering $50 for a poem, Diane submitted her work, got the $50, and went on to become a poet, or so the story goes. She published her first and only chapbook, Writing the One-Eyed Forward, with Contact 2 Press in 1981. Besides the chapbook, there are a few uncollected poems and other writings out there, including To Kill a Mockingbird, which is a novel that was never completed by Diane. She was also a prolific visual artist, and some of her artwork can be seen on the cover and throughout Writing the One-Eyed Forward. Diane lived, worked, wrote, performed, found community, and raised her daughter Britta on the Lower East Side. She was an active presence at the Nuyorican, a gathering of the tribes, the Poetry Project, and the American Indian Community House, amongst other places where poets and community gather. Diane passed away on December 22nd, 2006 in New York City. Okay, I'm just going to read a short excerpt from the overview. Quote, "Some people may be confused by some of the terms used in this book. Goshkabas is my family name and it translates into English to barber or cut hair," unquote, writes Diane Burns in the foreword to Writing the One-Eyed Forward. What follows are a series of possible origin stories of the 49 and how it came to be named. Burns lands on it, quote, "is a long story, and it's usually not the same story twice," unquote. Diane Burns is a trickster. She is a storyteller. In the space that her writing, the poems of Writing the One-Eyed Forward create, whether the words are in Anishinaabe or in English, there is a refusal to give definitive answers because there are none. Instead, truth, or what might be understood as truth, takes a different shape, has another place of origin. I often think of how I first came to know the poems and writing The One-Eyed Ford, which was by way of listening to a recording of Burns reading them at the Poetry Project in 1982, hosted by poet Bob Kaufman. This led me then to Bob, who generously shared his copy of the chapbook with me, the first time I had ever seen the entirety of this collection in print. And while seeing the work on the page was a revelation, something about that initial spoken transmission and reception, as in hearing her read the same work out loud, was what stayed. I think of the oral tradition and what is passed down from one generation to the next. The knowledge that is transmitted across time, space, from those who came before, that will be passed on to those who will someday, again, become those who will pass this knowledge on. The cyclical, layered connection of past, present, and future, to find what was left behind, or that which was left out of print for far too long. These connections, these intersections, to trace these cyclical steps backwards again and find what was left on the path is where I have come to find the work of Diane Burns. And I'm so grateful for her words, poems, this chapbook, her voice, this truth, de Bwewin, this knowledge shared, passed on through her poetry, life, this work. Through the digitization of this chapbook, her stories can continue to be passed on, brought forward, and resonate.
Thank you, Nicole. Allow me to welcome our next presenter, Mona Lisa Saloy, a scholar and educator who is streaming in from the heart of the 7th Ward in NOLA, just a few blocks away from Dillard University, if I'm not mistaken. And Dr. Saloy will be presenting on Beat Poet Bob Kaufman.
Hi, I'm Mona Lisa Saloy. I am a poet as well as a scholar and a folklorist. And I teach at Dillard University in the heart of the 7th Ward, as mentioned. And my invitation was to discuss Golden Sardines by Bob Kaufman, who was born and raised in my neighborhood. And people are just learning about that. For years, they just assumed he was a West Coast guy. And he certainly made a mark there and on the East Coast in the Northeast. But the bottom line is he's a wonderful poet, a fine poet, and a surrealist poet, and a sincere poet. Golden Sardines, his second collection, comes out in '67. And it is unusual and important. All of his work is important. And it is truly golden. I am working on a biography of his life. I've written about him and presented on him in the past. There is a wonderful documentary film by Billy Woodbury, award-winning film, called When I Die, I Won't Stay Dead. And it's on Bob Kaufman, and it really has, or encompasses, a lot of his life that was heretofore unknown, especially his labor union work and how he always fought for justice. But he left the East Coast and went to North Beach in San Francisco and became central to the Beat era. Now, it's interesting, San Francisco columnist Herb Caen is credited with coining the word beatnik, but all of his peers attribute that to Bob Kaufman, especially A.D. Winans, who is a poet and a critic. They said undisputably, Bob Kaufman coined the word beatnik and was the quintessential embodiment of what that is. So what does that mean? They were beat. He even co-founded and helped produce Beatitudes, which was a journal that came out of North Beach, published Mimeo in the beginning, and supported by City Lights. And it was him and Eileen Kaufman, his then wife, and Bill Margolis. And it continued for many years, but he was there at the beginning. And there are a lot of myths about him. We can't dispel all of that, but I want to get to Golden Sardines because it's unusual. Why? Because the opening is one poem that is 9 pages long and highly surreal, highly funny in many ways, but so serious. Now, why is that? It's called Caryl Chessman. And Caryl Chessman was an actual person. The person's name was Caryl, and Kaufman deletes the Y. So Caryl Chessman in Golden Sardines then becomes a persona, or becomes the voice of the real Caryl Chessman. Now, who was Caryl Chessman? He was actually a criminal, but he wasn't born that way. As a matter of fact, he started his criminal life in the Great Depression, stealing food to feed his family. When you hear that, I'm sure that touched Bob. But he was considered the red light killer, and he was accused of murder and rape. But he had a bad past and owned up to that, but always insisted on his innocence of this crime. And that raised a lot of issues mid-20th century about not only how do you prove innocence or guilt, and the whole notion of end of life for crimes, capital punishment. So Kaufman then, in these 9 pages, gives Caryl Chessman the voice he feels like he never had, or that was prevented from really expressing. And it's a wonderful poem. And so Kaufman was a performer in his own right, but the Caryl Chessman poem is serious. He is attacking the powers that be. He also attacks American, and he is not trying to be a savior, but certainly creatively imagining what this man is going through. And it's really kind of funny in that he opens it where the guy is addressing the PTA, the San Quentin PTA. So Kaufman does that. There's this juxtapositions of images that you can't, and it, not just the PTA in San Quentin, but Caryl Chessman is doing that from his gas chamber and leaving on an annual inspection of the Capitol, tours of Northern California deaf universities, a line that gets repeated throughout the poem in different ways. But it's Kaufman's compassion for a human being. And Chessman, the real Caryl Chessman, is white. And he sympathizes with him in surreal splendor because of unjust incarceration, unfair sentencing, and a system that jails people for no good reason often, especially how the ordinary guy loses power as a fate in this life. And he's extremely sympathetic to that. So he calls California sickly. That sickly California is writing death threats to the Wizard of Oz and is on trial in the stomach of Junipero Serra. So he's, all these flashes come in the surrealist vein. It is not what it is, whatever is on the other side of meaning. He even calls the beautiful home of Disneyland sickly for performing so poorly and driving Chessman mad enough to steal all the bases and return to his tomb to receive the last sacraments from Shirley Temple. Again, it's highly surreal. But Kaufman makes the actual nightmare that the true Caryl Chessman is going through, and however Kaufman envisions that. But he knows that he deserves and requires an appropriate defense and attempts to deliver that. Kaufman is also often expressing his disillusionment with the commercial America. That appears again and again. Writes that Chessman names the last week of December as National Week, offered, and then offers Jesus Christ free room and board. So Christmas is so far removed from the original intent, the sacred intent, that even the Christian Savior of the world needs aid. So, and he attacks that sacred time of the year that has now become an economic boom system at the same time, commits hilarity as a result, in a term of images that we just don't expect. And he's pointing to us the deterioration of the holiday season. All right. So this poem is way too long to discuss, but some questions. What can possibly be sacred anymore? And what can be trusted if such injustice is allowed to continue? So, and there's places where he talks to God, Chessman talks to God, and the persona says he is God, but he says, oh no, he's not. And there is a heroic sense here in that Caryl Chessman lays society's flaws bare, and how institutions fail people, and how they've grown unstable. And he minces no words in that. But it's Kaufman's creating this persona, makes these charges against the ills of society, unfair policing, unfair sentencing, and also to loneliness, to man's harm of the mother fatherland, nature, to the spirit of the individual versus the commercial machinations that were even then beginning to dominate America. So this collection has also other memorable poems that are very short. It's got a poem to Apollinaire called Unhistorical Events. And Apollinaire, of course, is the French poet and creator of colligrams, those poems that paint in words shaped like the object of the subject, but allude to more, as poems do. It's brief, but true in its praise, its compassion for the great poet who was misunderstood often in his own time. There are praise poems to women, quite a few. There's one to Sheila, who makes lewd, caustic remarks to the thirsty old men. One prose poem to Heather Bell, further called Chorus, who in many descriptions just loves jazz, is simply cool, it needs a cool cape. And you just have to love that. And there's one to Sarasvati, the East Indian goddess of higher education, creativity, intelligence. And there's a request by the speaker for intelligence, art, so-called, to live 100 autumns. So Kaufman is highly original. And there's another one called Jazz Chick, who flows music from her breast vibrating. Her music, jazz. And there's another brief poem called Inside Connie, and it's not what anybody expects. He's always surprising. And there's even one poem where Kaufman talks about his own personal insecurity and the power of poetry, plus the desire to meet its heights or failing miserably at it. It's called A Terror More Certain, just a piece of it. He says, a terror is more certain than all the rare, desirable, popular songs I know. And the stanza ends, and never realize how bad my writing is because I am poor and I symbolize myself. And each line in 5 stanzas are a turn on what is something certain or something that is rare. And you have to understand about Kaufman, he's born and raised in New Orleans, in my neighborhood. His mother was a school teacher, but he's one of 13 children. His father passes away. His father was a hardworking Black man. He had Kaufman had brothers and sisters, but the father dies. And well, first of all, when a woman at the turn of the 20th century becomes married or expectant, you can no longer teach. You can no longer work. So she is then forced at home with the children. So they read. She bought libraries on sale, and they had debates in the evening at the dinner table. And he grew up toasting or swapping tales with men in the neighborhood and on the porch. And he was very much a part of the oral tradition of the culture and the literary tradition that he inherited from his family. And many of his siblings were teachers, became teachers, and really responsible people in the community. Now, because the father died, people often said he was middle class. Well, if you have a single mother with 13 kids, really? So there's people interested in that, but the bottom line is he leaves finishes school. There were many years that people said he ran away from home at 13 and went to sea. He finished his high school and he joins the Merchant Marines. His oldest brother had done that. And what you may not know is New Orleans, prior to the Vietnam War, there were more blacks who joined either the military or the Merchant Marines from New Orleans, than any place else in the country. And part of that was Jim Crow. There weren't a lot of jobs. If you weren't a particular craftsman and you didn't want to do that work, you could travel and do it through the military or the Merchant Marines. And so Kaufman does that, but the situation is dire, because if you know anything about the Merchant Marines, they carry all the equipment to war. So sometimes they're bombed, sometimes they're shipwrecked, and there's an interesting, I won't go into that now, but he was shipwrecked at one point, had frostbite. There's stories about that. But reading, literature, that is who he is inside of himself. And so other poems, I guess the main thing about this collection is you're going to get truth and you're going to get jazz. And jazz is lovemaking for Bob Kaufman. It is what art should be. It is something, there's also blues poems, and there's one homage to Charlie Parker, one of his favorite jazz instrumentalists, simply called Roundabout Midnight. That's like jazz music, soul stirring, sexual, alludes to what happens in that special time of the night. There's tequila jazz, where folks party with melody rapping smiles with tequila. There's the poem His Horn, that's totally a reverent act of a jazz horn player. Is it Parker? Charlie Parker? Another one of his favorites is. And this horn player's jazz walks forever. So I did want to read something, if there's time for that. And I'll pick a shorter piece to read. And the penultimate poem in the book, Jazzo War Memoir, Jazz, Don't Listen to It at Your Own Risk. The message is, you want to be happy? Listen to jazz. You want to know love? Listen to jazz. You want to feel all that life feels? Listen to jazz, because all that emotion is there. And interestingly enough, he creates a, how can I say it? Not just an homage to jazz, but it's called Kurisongo, and it is a scat. That is, it is the language of jazz. It is how vocalists encapsulate the music. Kurisongo. And I'm gonna try a little bit of it. Debet, seglations, flow, coo, baba, skash, skash, show doobies, wagga, wallow, wallow, geep, bob, nava, gila, nava, sperrita, sperrita, head so, dead edition, boom edition, storm squall, bees, waggle, loco es loro, lo, vid, me the repo, patop, pop, pop, or what pop. Digat, scaref, blog, manglo, clog, mango, clopo, glego, blee, asa free, angola, bee, ain't pop, pop, balolo, pop, pop. It's meant to be sung. It is a scat, as jazz musicians do, jazz vocalists do. And that is just really fun. It's just fun. So for me, for Bob Kaufman, I just hope his literary legacy is reclaimed for his brilliance and his centrality to the beat era, his talent as a writer, his powerful poetry, his visionary ideals of justice, and his rightful place as a significant forerunner to the Black arts movement. So thank you, Poets House, for all that you are and all that you do for poets, and for having me.
Thank you so much. Wow, what a performance. Mona Lisa Saloy. I'm going to welcome back Nicole Wallace and my colleague Suzanne Weiss. What drew you initially to Bob Kaufman that he's now become such a paramount subject for you?
I was an undergraduate student. I met young Black writers who introduced me to the voices of the Black arts movement. I didn't know they existed, was never taught about Black literature. Of course, it was being produced, but not promoted. And I learned about the great voices who were young then, Ishmael Reed and Sonia Sanchez and Alice Walker and others that came later. But that set me on a path to write. And even though I heard all these great writers, the New Orleans neighborhood was not there. The 7th Ward was our Wakanda. Bob Kaufman is born and raised here. One of my classmates, a Cleveland poet who is now passed away, L.H. Carson, he used to say Elouage. He turned me on to Bob. He said, what, you're from New Orleans? You're from the 7th Ward and you don't know Bob Kaufman? And he used to carry Bob Kaufman's books with him. And once I read Bob Kaufman, it was on. If you know anything about him, it's not a myth, he took a Buddhist vow of silence for 10 years from the Vietnam War until the assassination of President Kennedy. And I didn't know about that. All I knew is we didn't hear anything about him. There was no more publications. I thought he was dead. I eventually became poet in residence at the African American Historical and Cultural Society. But before I became that, I attended workshops there, and one, Bob Kaufman showed up. And everybody said, don't you know who that is? And I said, who? And there's the brother. And he was there with Lynn Wilde, who was then the woman in his life. And I met him. And he had listened to my work and knew that I was from his neighborhood. And we just had the New Orleans thing, and it was on. And that's who he was with a lot of poets. A.D. Winans says stuff like that. Other people, and even Ginsberg talks about him. That's the way he was with you. And he came to hear me often and watched me, and I read with him sometimes on different programs. He was really frail by then, near the end of his life. And Lynn Wilde exchanged correspondence with me. And I returned home to deepen my work and went to graduate school to get another degree. And Lynn Wilde wrote me and said, I had to do that work on Bob Kaufman, that nobody else could in the way that I did. And just life intervened. My father was very ill. It was a struggle. Finished my degrees, the MFA, the PhD, decided to focus my dissertation on Bob Kaufman. I never lost the cause to do justice to Bob Kaufman. So here he is in January '86, and he passes away from emphysema, but there was a lot of other things going on with him. The electric shock treatments. I mean, this is a man, and this is why he loved Caryl Chessman and wanted to speak for him, because his wife at the time, Eileen Kaufman, recalls that he was jailed over 59 times in 1 year. And for those of us alive today, we understand how Black men are singled out again and again and again, and Black women. How, first of all, America jails more people than anyone in the free world. And Blacks, ridiculously, so much that they've wiped generations off the map. When I was a kid, we were more than 25% of the population. We're less than 12% now. That's genocide, folks. So Bob Kaufman saw this and understood this, and he was, unfortunately, a victim of that. I mean, he was put into Bellevue for walking on the grass in New York City. Who sends someone to the loony bin for walking on the grass? And then to receive electric shock treatments because he jumped on a table and could spout poetry. He was jailed again and again. Now, one particular cop in San Francisco, Bigarini, was racist, and he knew that Bob Kaufman had a white woman, and he just didn't want to have it. And so he told all his buddies, and they gave him just hell. And so knowing all of that and learning more about Bob and sharing with Lynn Wilde, and I finished the degree, and then the storm hit. And it's taken 16 moves in 14 years and 12 different addresses, 3 states and 5 cities to get to here, to get home. You're looking at my home rebuilt new. post-Katrina and losing over 5,000 books. But I never lost the passion for giving Bob his justice. So I was helpful to Billy Woodbury at many times while he was doing the documentary. And he would always tease me because, matter of fact, he took the title from the title of my dissertation, When I Die, I Won't Stay Dead, which is from a Kaufman poem. And I want to just really, really give him the honor and the tribute he deserves, because he suffered a lot as a Black man walking the streets, as a poet who had so much insight and compassion and caring. And he encouraged all the beats. He was the one who took Ginsberg and Kerouac into the Negro Streets at Dawn from the Howell poem. As a matter of fact, Ginsberg and Kerouac had their stint in the Merchant Marine. So and Kaufman shared that. And so they knew him in New York City. They weren't in the Marines at the same time or in the same places because people were sent vast directions, but they shared a lot in common in addition to being anti-everything.
What a generous response. And one of the topics I would actually like to also talk about with you and Nicole, who I'm going to hear from shortly, is dealing with tokenism in these communities. Nicole, how about yourself in terms of your nearness to Diane Burns when you discovered her? I mean, you have more than just that intellectual connection. You are at the Poetry Project right now, and you are in the very communities, the spaces where Diane and Britta lived, and where Diane flourished in different overlapping communities. Maybe you could share.
I only first learned about Diane's work a few years ago, actually, but I've been at the Poetry Project. I started interning there in 2007 in February, and I had never heard of Diane or her work from anything at the Poetry Project or anybody in the community. Her work never came up, which, knowing now that her chapbook, I'm not sure the last time it was in print, maybe in the early 80s, and it's just been away. Like, maybe that's a part of the reason, but there are obviously a lot of other reasons why her work wouldn't have been more widely shared. So I found out about her work, and when I did, I was really curious to learn more about her. I had just started writing in Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe language, in my own poetry shortly before, and I just had never really found anybody else in the New York poetry community who is doing that, and especially in Anishinaabe. So I found her work. I wanted to know more, obviously, very instantly. I found Bob's poetry spots online. And then there was one other video of her reading work at the American Indian Community House. There was some kind of like reading or social or something like that. So those were the two videos that were available. And then there were just a few of her poems available online. And that's when I was like, there has to be something at the Poetry Project in the archive that Diane Burns maybe read here. So I checked her database, and lo and behold, there were several readings at the Poetry Project that Diane Burns had given. One in 1981 in the fall, and one in the fall of 1982. And then there are some other later ones, but I believe those are more group readings. So I was able to get these recordings. Our archive at the Poetry Project was sold to the Library of Congress in 2006. And just recently, within the last few years, the audio has been digitized. So I was able to get those recordings, and that's really when I had this more full experience of Diane's work. And her performance style is not just like reading necessarily. There's a lot of music in her work that doesn't necessarily come across on the page. So yeah, hearing those recordings was really important to me and was really my first full kind of experience of her work. And then later, like I mentioned, I was finally able to see Riding the One-Eyed Forward, which is a beautiful book.
Yeah, I had some questions for Mona Lisa.
Okay.
I wanted to know, I assume that you have a copy of Golden Sardine?
I did. I lost over 5,000 books. Everything I own drowned. And
Oh,
I've
so
been
sad.
replacing my library as I can. And I do have a room full of books, and people tend to give me books, but you know, as scholars and writers, we have a very specialized library.
And my other question is, I was curious about Bob Kaufman's presence in New Orleans now.
Not enough. That's why I've got to do this biography. I've presented on him here at different conferences, but he is not a household name. And it's because his fame, his participation in literary readings, but mostly on the East Coast, in the Northeast, and in the West Coast. Now, he did spend time in Texas, but he wasn't doing a lot of poetry then, other than writing. He was writing. And I was able to really get close to his brother Donald and heard about that. And so I write about that. But no, he is not a household name, and I want to change that. I want to change that. Now, City Lights has just published his collected works. Thank you, City Lights publishers. Lawrence Ferlinghetti is now 100 and still jamming. And so if you can support them, support Poets House and City Lights, because they have done his collected works. And there's even some unpublished works in the back. And Devorah Major, whose dad wrote The Panther is a Black Cat, she was also a poet laureate of the state of California. Neely Cherkowski, Raymond Foy, one of his publishers, and Tate Swindell all contribute to this.
In Maria Damon's essay, she talks about all of mythologizing about Bob Kaufman. She mentions you as a scholar and James Smethurst, as well as the documentary, And When I Die, I Won't Stay Dead, as being a remedy. And I wonder if you could talk more about why you think there's been this obsession with mythologizing Bob Kaufman in a particular way.
I think part of it is insensitivity. I think part of it is a mistake of history. For example, let's go back to Kerouac. Kerouac dies young. And everything he writes, every letter, every piece of paper becomes valuable. Allen Ginsberg says, "What?" So he starts his own papers. He does press releases. He was in marketing. He does press releases. He promotes himself. He was successful. The Beats who promoted themselves were successful. Bob Kaufman was a sincere Buddhist. He did not do that. He was not after material gain in that sense. I certainly wanted to make a living, and he was a hardworking man. He had been a merchant marine. He did a little this, a little that, and was a family man. But they promoted themselves. Also, here's a man who was so disappointed in America with the Vietnam War that he takes a vow of silence. So now, the other side of that, because of the beatings by the police, which wasn't just 59 times in 1 year, it was year after year after year, from the mid-50s into the 60s, that deteriorated him physically. So he was in a lot of pain. So he stayed high. He drank. He took whatever somebody gave him. And some people would give him drugs to get him loose to perform. There are even videos on YouTube of this happening. And so some people only saw him tipsy and ranting when he was not that well. They didn't really know the seriousness of this man. They just wanted to be entertained. So he was taken advantage of. And he let people do it because it wasn't that big a deal to him. And he had already survived so many things that could have killed him. And some of his poems talk about that death was near. And I know he felt the pain, the physical dwindling of his body. And some of it was due to age. I mean, he died at 60. I'm well past that. So that's young to me now. So I know how hard he struggled just to keep doing poetry. And he was proud of those books. He was proud of his broadsides. And he didn't have to read from them because he memorized everything from all of Pound to all of Eliot to all the greats, because that was his gift in this life. And so a lot of people thought he was an oral poet because he was extemporaneous and would draw on this poet or that. But he wrote his own original work. But he was just a performer. And long before spoken word was hip. And because he was so good at it, he was the rage. But people just diminished his importance because later in his life, he just shriveled up physically because of all the beatings. I just think he got up, and he lived through it. A lot of Black men don't. They're taken out too quickly. So it's amazing that he continued to write. And thank God for Eileen, who documented a lot of his work, because he had 2 fires, whole manuscripts burned. So there's no telling what we lost. And unfortunately, there's no papers. But there are a lot of articles that get it wrong. And some people have been sincere. They just haven't done all the homework. And it takes a lot of time. So I just haven't given up. And the other thing is, in terms of the historical mistake, there is no beat culture without Black people. The whole beat thing comes from jazz. The whole appropriation of Black lingo and vernacular is central to the whole beat movement. But Blacks don't get credit for that. Amiri Baraka knew that. He changed his name from Leroy Jones. And Ted Jones knew that. And Ted Jones is still with us, God bless him. And so they were the 3 beats. Ted Jones, Leroy Jones, and Bob Kaufman. They were there, mid-20th century, doing their beat thing. The reclamation of that is important. So I do an essay. Mine is a central essay in the Big Beat book, Beat Culture in the New America by the Whitney Museum. And it's called Black Beats and Black Issues. And I attempt to reclaim that moment in history. The whole beat era owes a tremendous legacy to Black culture and Black vernacular and to the oral tradition and performance.
Nicole, if we could just pivot to you and Diane Burns. What I find compelling about Diane Burns, when I caught your incredible reading that you put together at the Museum of New York City not too long ago in March, was Diane Burns being right in the mix of the poetry scenes in the East Village, Lower East Side, and Diane Burns' obvious affiliations, camaraderie, familial kinships with folks like Bob Holman, Steve Cannon. But then I think Britta, her daughter, also read a poem where the speaker talks about being ethnically misidentified all the time. And I wonder, in your research of Diane Burns' life and talking to Britta, what was her experience like moving through this space, this art space, as a Native poet?
There's that poem, yes, which says a lot in and of itself about how, and maybe what Diane Burns experienced being an Indigenous poet, being an urban Indigenous poet at that time in New York City. But I haven't read anything else by Diane or heard anything else from Britta about what it might have been like to be an Indigenous poet at that time. So I can't really speak to that.
I just saw this interview with Ishmael Reed, an Asian American Writers Workshop, and the polycultural experience of these poets, both Diane and Bob Kaufman. How might that experience impact their identities as a poet, the permissions that they give themselves to share or not share their work? How were they inspired? I think specifically Ishmael Reed referred to Bob Kaufman and Ted Jones vis-a-vis how they were viewed by Kerouac and them. He called it like Kerouac and them were really tokenizing them. But it seems from your account that it seems a little bit more nuanced and complicated than that.
It's complicated. Let's see if I can give you the skinny. Number one, he was fluent in Spanish. He spoke Castilian Spanish. And according to his brother, he even passed Spanish and took trips to Mexico. One with his wife, Eileen, later, after he had gotten a fellowship, but early on with Kerouac and Ginsberg. So they were travel buddies. They were on the road together to some degree. And they were, I guess, respectful of their art. Plus, they were close in age. Kaufman's born in 25. I think Kerouac, who's a Canadian, is 22, and Ginsberg is 26. So they're very close in age. So they speak the same language for their generation. And Kaufman can speak to everyone on the West Coast because he just doesn't see color. He sees humanity. It's just that he was not interested in the commercialization of art, of poetry. And even though, and Kerouac being a Canadian and knowing how that worked and worked it, and Ginsberg seeing that and admiring that, and hey, what's wrong with success? It's just that, and Kaufman was happy to go with his friends and beat bongos and listen and make jazz or listen to jazz and write and share it. And even though he was proud of those books, it is complicated. He had complicated relationships, but he'd rather be alone. He'd rather be on top of Mount Tamalpais, meditating. He just wasn't, literally people forced him to drink and take drugs to get him to perform sometimes because he liked being alone. He was introspective and nerdy like all of us. And I love that about him, even though he performed as a performer. So those relationships are complicated. It's not that they dissed him necessarily. And also because his manuscripts burned, sometimes it was hard to find enough work to publish. But he sent his work out. Eileen typed it up for him, but he wrote, and constantly on anything he could find. And those of us who write, I think all of us do that. We journal, thank God for digital notes, because I used to write on anything. And I can see how he just escaped some of it. And then some of it too, if you're in jail, what can you do? What can people do for you? And there were many fundraisers to get him out again and again and again. I'm telling you, it was a complicated relationships for him all around. But everyone who ever knew him, really knew him, had really great things to say about him. And his peers respected him.
I wanted to ask a question of Nicole. I was thinking about the event that you curated at the Museum of the City of New York earlier this year that was inspired by Diane Burns. And you had an amazing roster of artists and writers who it seemed were doing work that was in dialogue with Burns. And I don't know how many of them were really familiar with Burns's work, or if it was your thinking that they were kind of the next generation of where Burns might have been heading. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that.
When I was invited to coordinate that program, the point of the program, well, it started off as being a poetry-based program, but I felt like there are so many Indigenous artists that are active and living in New York right now, and specifically the program needed to be centered around Indigenous folks living in New York City that were making work. So I didn't want it to be limited just to the frame of poetry when there is so much powerful and important work being done outside of poetry, but also within poetry. And I knew that the piece by Bob Holman, the Alphabet City Serenade video, was going to be included in the exhibition, and I was thinking a lot about Diane's work, and I was thinking about how Diane's work is not just poetry on the page, though it is, and then it's not just performance, it's song, it's all of these things all at once. And I felt like what she was doing was so different and new. I mean, obviously I was not around in the early 80s, and I was not involved in poetry then in New York City because I was a kid and not living here. But yeah, I just feel like what she was doing even today, like hearing the recordings of her performances where she's performing Big Fun, but she's tapping on the microphone. She's singing at the beginning, and then it turns to poetry. And so in thinking about the frame of the night, I wanted to include other Indigenous artists, poets, musicians, fashion designers, all of these folks who are like doing really, really cool, innovative work that's like, it's engaging on so many levels. It's engaging with community, it's engaging with culture, it's engaging with language, sustainability, all of these things. And that, I guess that's what I was thinking about Diane Burns and her work, and then how today, what it feels like in the arts community and in the activist community with Indigenous folks that I know. So
unfortunately, we are out of time. And as ever, we are just scratching the surface of our engagements with Diane Burns and Bob Kaufman, and certainly with the incredible scholarship and research and discoveries that both our guests today, Lisa Saloy and Nicole Wallace, have been making in the service of greater awareness of both Kaufman and Burns's poetry. Thank you both, Nicole. Thank you both, Lisa. Thank you, Suzanne, for joining me. Keep safe, stay compassionate, and until next time, I'll see you soon.
If you've enjoyed these programs, please consider giving a contribution to Poets House. For more than 30 years, they've kept the door wide open to everyone for the joy of poetry. Recently, they have temporarily had to shut the door and are reeling from the financial implications. Please give, even a small donation if you can. Thank you.